Hi everyone, my name is aderu, and for my research project, I implemented multicultural literature into my third grade classroom. I live in a very rural town in Mountain View, Wyoming. I work at a K-8 school where the diversity within my school is non-existent. I teach third grade, and there are 61 students, of which 58 are Caucasian, and 2 are Hispanic or Latino, and 1 that is classified as dual race. Based on these racial and ethnic demographics, it validates and supports the lack of multicultural diversity within the school. My town lacks diversity in so many ways, and my students have very little understanding of multiculturalism or other cultures. I thought by sharing multicultural children's literature, it would help support my students' understanding of how diverse our world is, learn about different cultures, become global citizens, and understand how to show empathy, love, and respect towards other cultures. Before I even started my research project, I looked throughout my school library and my personal and realized that I don't have access to a large amount of multicultural books. From that moment, I knew I needed to make a change and supply more multicultural books for my students to read and learn about. For my project, I chose to introduce and implement multicultural children's literature for my students and had my students have discussions, draw pictures, and complete writing responses based on the story they read. Before sharing any books with my students, I made sure to review them to help ensure that they would not offend the culture that I am sharing, and it shared positive information and stories about the culture. I found many of my multicultural books through a reliable site called Multicultural Children's Book Day, where their sole mission is to raise awareness for kids' books that celebrate diversity, but to get more of these books into the classrooms and libraries within schools. On this same site, it shares that only 10% of children's books published have diversity content. Once I found appropriate books for my students, I opened up a whole class discussion with my students about what they know about the word culture. My students had a hard time giving me their understandings. One of my students stated that around the world, Mrs. Daru, people do different things than we do. I then shared the word multiculturalism, and my students had no idea of this meaning for this word. I expressed the importance that we need to learn about and understand different ethnic groups around the world. One book that I shared with my students is called Ada's Violin, The Story of the Recycled Orchestra of Paraguay by Susan Hood. Before reading this book to my students, I had a whole group discussion and I asked my students what they thought of the words recycled orchestra. One of my students stated, "Mrs. Drew, it sounds like recycled instruments that are being used." I then showed my students where Paraguay is on a map. This was a great connection because we learned about the continent of South America that day as well. This is actually a true story based in Paraguay and of students who are not able to have instruments of their own because they are expensive as a house. They had to build their own instruments out of recycled materials. This was an eye-opening experience for my students because they didn't realize that this was occurring. One student said, "Mrs. Drew, here in our music class, our music teacher lets us practice on instruments and we don't have to share like the students in Ada's music lesson." I said, "I know, and we are very lucky to even be able to have music class in school, as many schools have discontinued music and band classes." My students also asked, "Why is there so much trash around the houses in Paraguay?" We talked about how Paraguay is a very poor country in South America. My students also recognized that the language that was spoken in Paraguay is different from ours, and also the houses look different from ours in the United States as well. Um, this the music teacher at Mountain View Elementary School gave me a violin that she got from Jamaica. I was able to share the violin with my students because it was carved completely out of wood. Instruments are way too expensive to buy in Jamaica, and it's the same thing as also in Paraguay, like we had a discussion about. My students then understood the connection with the violin from Jamaica with the violin that Ada, the character from the story, created with recycled materials. After reading the story, we then watched a video of the actual recycled orchestra. My students loved how the story they read came to life and they saw the recycled instruments being used. From my research, I found that my students enjoyed reading the multicultural books. They wanted to learn more and more about each of the cultures and countries. After reading many of the stories, I was able to tell them that I have been to those countries, so I was able to experience the culture. For one example, I went to Peru with my parents, and so I showed many of my pictures from my trip to Peru. My students now really want to go to Machu Picchu, and that was discussed in one of the stories that we read. My students enjoyed hearing about the different foods, family traditions, music, places, languages, and many more. Before my students left for Thanksgiving, I read a story about a little girl and her family's tradition for Thanksgiving is not to have turkey, but to have duck. My students learned that the girl is Vietnamese, and this was their family tradition. My students responded of how different cultures have different traditions during holidays. My students shared how they connect with the particular culture and the character within the story. Another component that we made sure to discuss was how to show empathy, respect, and compassion towards these cultures. This is a skill that we are focusing on in our second step social skills program. My research was important because not only did it help me learn how to create multicultural education within my classroom, it also helped me make sure that I am selecting appropriate books for my students to gain understanding of multiculturalism. This research has also showed me the importance of providing multicultural literature to help our students now and in the future. Our students need to be exposed to different cultures because they will interact with people within those cultures. With our world becoming more and more diverse, our students need to experience and learn about cultures now to help them understand how to show empathy and love towards others in different cultures. Lastly, some implications that I had during my research was that my students had little or no background knowledge about any culture. Also, I had a tough time finding a variety of multicultural literature that was available and was very limited. This makes it difficult for me to expose my students to diverse literature, but also get multicultural literature into the hands of my students to read. Finally, I don't have any coworkers to collaborate about multicultural education and literature with to help formulate other approaches and ways to help support me as a teacher. I can't wait to continue to share more and more multicultural with my students.